The sound of wood cracking wasn't what woke me that morning. It was Tucker's low growl by the door, the kind he only gave when something truly foul was nearby. I rolled out of bed, still half asleep, and stepped out onto my porch barefoot, coffee mug in hand, expecting a raccoon. What I saw instead was an excavator mid-swing, snapping the last beam of the bridge my wife built with her bare hands before she died. And standing next to it, arms folded like a queen inspecting her new moat, was Karen Delaney. I didn't drop my coffee. I crushed the mug in my hand. It's funny how fast the mind moves in moments like that. My first thought wasn't about the cost of the bridge, or the legality of what was happening. It was Lila, her laughing in that old straw hat, sanding the railings just right, planting wildflowers along the edges so butterflies would follow us. That bridge was her heartbeat made of cedar and nails. And now it was splinters beneath a bulldozer driven by an HOA contractor named Gary, Bulldozer, Dempsey, who probably thought property lines were just friendly suggestions. Karen turned and waved at me like she was offering me a muffin. "Morning, Mr. Harlan. Just cleaning up some violations. Eyesores, you understand." I stared at her, unable to form words as she pointed at my land like it was hers. "We found this structure encroached on HOA aesthetic boundaries. It wasn't approved. My land. My bridge. My wife's memory. No warning. No notice. Just gone." My fingers dripped blood from the ceramic mug shards I hadn't realized I'd clenched too tightly. Tucker barked and lunged forward, leash taut. I called him back with a whisper and he stopped on a dime, but not before Gary jumped and nearly fell off the excavator. I stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, heart pounding like war drums. "You just made a mistake, Karen," I said, voice low and flat. Her smile twitched. "You'll want to read the bylaws," she replied, as if they were scripture. "This structure wasn't documented and violates community view rights from 3 properties bordering the lake." She motioned to the mostly artificial pond behind her, the one the HOA boasted about like it was the Grand Canyon. "The lake is a central amenity, and we're simply preserving its natural beauty." "Natural?" I laughed, finally. Not because it was funny, but because it was so painfully stupid. That lake was man-made. In fact, I knew exactly how it worked, because my land fed its flow through a tunnel system I'd inherited with the property. Lila and I used to joke it was our secret river beneath the earth. The HOA didn't just remove a bridge. They declared war without knowing they built their fortress on top of my plumbing. Within minutes, Sheriff Riley Boone pulled up in his cruiser, dust clouds swirling behind him. He stepped out and took in the scene like a man seeing an accident he was already tired of before it happened. "Karen," he said, already weary. "What in the name of decency are you doing?" She launched into her sermon about aesthetic integrity and community standards, waving her printed forms like victory flags. Riley looked at me, saw the blood on my hand, and raised an eyebrow. "You all right, Mitch?" I nodded once. "For now." His eyes scanned the wreckage of the bridge, then narrowed. "You file a permit for this, Karen?" She went quiet. Riley stepped closer. "That's not rhetorical." Gary Dempsey fidgeted in the seat of his machine. She said it was approved by the board," he muttered. "Didn't know it needed county stuff." Riley sighed so hard it rattled the leaves. "This bridge is on Mitch's land." "That lake behind you?" "Last I checked, only half of it touches HOA lots. You may have just trespassed and destroyed private property." Karen opened her mouth, then shut it. I could see the gears turning in her head, realizing maybe, just maybe, she stepped in something deeper than duck poop. But I didn't care about legal lines in that moment. I cared about the sound Lila's bridge made as it snapped, like a tree being felled in slow motion. My wife built that bridge with love, sanding every plank herself, sketching its curves in a notebook she kept under her pillow. The day she finished it, we slow danced on it under the moonlight. It wasn't just wood. It was her legacy. Her resting memory. And they took it apart like a rotted fence post. Riley eventually ordered the crew to stand down and told Karen to report to the county offices by morning. But the damage was done, I didn't speak much the rest of that day. I sat on my porch, hand bandaged, watching the sun set over a broken path to nowhere. Tucker sat beside me, tail still, like he was mourning too. That night, I dug through the filing cabinet Lila labeled "Stuff HOA shouldn't know about." Inside were our land plats, original deeds, and something else, an engineering diagram of the old irrigation tunnel that fed the HOA lake. Lila always planned ahead. Always knew people like Karen would come around one day, pushing rules where they didn't belong. The diagram was clear: the HOA lake was fed entirely through our property. It relied on our underground water access to stay full and fresh. Without it, the lake would stagnate within weeks. Without us, it was a bowl waiting to dry. Karen didn't just burn a bridge. She cut the cord to her own oxygen and hadn't realized it yet. That night I slept like a man with a mission. When the sun came up, I fed Tucker, put on my old work boots, and fired up the tractor I hadn't touched since Lila passed. The engine coughed to life like it knew revenge was on the menu. It was time to show the HOA what happened when you stole from a man who had nothing left to lose, and everything left to protect. The bridge may be gone, but the tunnel still flowed. For now. The morning after the bridge incident, I didn't waste time mourning. The sorrow had burned away, leaving something cold and focused in its place. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee untouched, staring at Lila's land files spread out like a treasure map. She had labeled everything so carefully, color-coded tabs, pencil annotations, her neat handwriting still dancing across margins like she was whispering instructions. The surveyor's plat from 1984 was the most important. It showed the clear boundaries between my land and the property the HOA called their pride and joy, the artificial lake they'd built just over a decade ago. But what caught my eye wasn't the borders. It was the notation near the bottom. Subterranean irrigation tunnel, active flow, original 1922 line, feeds West Basin. That line ran directly beneath my land and stretched like a quiet artery toward the lake they worshipped like a god. I stood and walked out behind the barn, toward the section Lila had once called the roots of the farm. I hadn't touched it in years. Brush had overgrown most of it, but I knew what I was looking for. Past the rusted trellis, beneath a bed of wild lilacs, there it was, a round metal hatch, half buried and covered in moss. Lila had built a small bench near it. She used to sit there, saying she could feel the hum of water moving below. I remember thinking she was being poetic. Turns out, she was being literal. I grabbed a crowbar from the shed, jammed it under the edge, and lifted. The hatch groaned and creaked, like it hadn't been opened since Roosevelt was president. But beneath it, there was a tunnel, stone-lined, narrow, and unmistakably man-made. A shallow stream flowed through it, glistening in the early light, clean and clear. This wasn't some accidental runoff. This was the lifeline for the lake. Back inside, I made some calls. First to the county survey office, where an old friend named James worked. He remembered my wife and remembered the drama years ago when the HOA first petitioned to build that lake. They needed a fresh water source, he explained. That tunnel was their best option, but it was never permanently granted. Lila refused to sign a perpetual easement. Said she didn't trust them. I felt pride swell in my chest. Of course she didn't. She knew exactly what kind of people they were. James faxed me copies of the original agreement. It was temporary, 10 years. It had expired 4 years ago. The HOA had no legal right to that water anymore. They were running on borrowed flow. Next, I called Marco, an old construction buddy who owed me more than a few favors. He worked in drainage control and owed his union membership to a favor I pulled for him back when the city tried to shut down his shop. Need a flow gate, I told him. And I need it quiet. He chuckled. You going beavers on somebody, Mitch? I didn't answer. He just laughed again and said he'd bring the parts himself. Always liked your wife. She had more brains than all the HOA boards combined. I agreed and gave him the address. By noon, he was parked behind the barn with a box full of industrial plumbing hardware and a grin on his face. We worked fast. The tunnel wasn't wide, but with some flexible pipe sections, a reinforced valve, and a little elbow grease, we installed a remote-controlled gate deep inside. The idea was simple: flip a switch, and the water stops flowing. The lake would stop receiving fresh water immediately. Within days, algae would build. Within weeks, the smell would drive people mad. Without a pump or supplemental source, it would become a mosquito-infested pit. I didn't need to damage anything. I just had to stop helping. That night, I sat on the bridge foundation, just 2 stone posts where would once connected memory to reality. Tucker lay beside me, watching the moon rise over the lake. It still shimmered, still fooled people into thinking it was beautiful. But I knew what was coming. I wasn't about destruction. I was about withdrawal. They took what was never theirs to take. I was merely closing the tap. By the 3rd day, reports started trickling in. Literally. HOA members complained about a strange smell coming from the water. A couple residents spotted fish floating belly up. Karen issued a community newsletter blaming natural seasonal changes. I nearly choked on my sandwich when I read that line. She still didn't know what she'd done. Still thought she was in control. I knew it wouldn't take long before things escalated. On the 4th day, I spotted Gary Dempsey standing near the lake's edge with a rake, trying to push dead fish toward the shore. He looked like a man rethinking his career choices. That same afternoon, Karen showed up at the edge of my property again, arms crossed, face tight with frustration. She didn't cross the boundary line, though. I think the sheriff's warning still echoed in her head. "We've noticed something unusual with the lake," she called out. "Anything you'd care to disclose?" I didn't move from my rocking chair. "I'd care to disclose a lot of things, Karen," I replied. "But I don't think you'd like most of them." She scowled and stormed off, heels stabbing into the gravel like she was trying to make it bleed. Later that evening, Sheriff Boone came by. He didn't come with sirens or questions, just a 6-pack and a lawn chair. We sat on the porch watching the sun dip low, casting orange across the dry creek that once housed my bridge. "They're blaming beavers now," he said after a sip. "Karen thinks they chewed through a supply line." I chuckled. "Beavers are smarter than most of her board." Boone nodded. "You doing something?" he asked casually. I didn't answer directly. Instead, I handed him one of Lila's old maps. "That's the truth of the land," I said. "Everything on it. Everything under it." He studied it for a moment, then looked up and smiled. "Well, I'll be damned." By the end of the week, the lake had turned a sickly green. HOA members began demanding refunds on their dues. Parents stopped letting their kids play near the shore. Real estate agents removed lake access from listings. And Karen? She started holding emergency HOA meetings every other night, pacing in front of foldable tables, fuming at imaginary saboteurs. She had no idea she was looking in the wrong direction. She had no idea the roots she thought she'd severed were just reawakening. And I hadn't even pulled the full plug yet. I was just letting them stew. Letting the pressure build. Because when the water stops, the silence gets loud. And people start noticing who's really in control. The 3rd week began with a heatwave that couldn't have come at a better time. Temperatures soared, and the HOA's precious lake began to show signs of stress even faster than I expected. Algae coated the surface like someone had poured green paint across it. The once clear water now bubbled near the edges, thick with scum and a sharp odor that wafted through open windows like a rotting casserole no one wanted to claim. Parents walking their toddlers along the HOA's trail gagged and turned back early. Duck families abandoned the shoreline, choosing instead to waddle over to the ditch behind my barn, where fresh water still trickled freely from the well-fed pond Lila and I had built for our garden. I didn't need to say a word. Nature was speaking louder than any HOA newsletter ever could. I spent that Monday with Tucker digging a new runoff trench near the old irrigation gate. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to stay one step ahead. If Karen ever got smart enough to hire someone who could find the control point, I'd be ready to seal it up again even deeper. The gate I'd installed with Marco was working perfectly, restricting just enough water to create visible damage while avoiding immediate legal consequences. It was a slow revenge, and I enjoyed every minute. Still, I had no plans of dragging this out forever. I wasn't trying to destroy the lake. I was making a point, one they'd never forget. Around noon, I heard an engine approaching. Not the sheriff's cruiser or Marco's work truck, but something new. I wiped sweat from my brow and walked to the front gate where a black SUV had pulled up, windows tinted, HOA logo slapped on the side like a badge of honor. Out stepped a man in a gray suit who looked like he hadn't stepped outdoors in 10 years. His shoes sunk a little in the dirt and he frowned, brushing imaginary dust off his pants. Karen was in the passenger seat, lips pursed so tight they looked like they were trying to escape her face. The man introduced himself as Kenneth Broyle, HOA legal counsel. He tried to hand me a folder thick with paperwork, but I didn't take it. Instead, I motioned to the stone line marking my boundary. That's county land behind you. This here is mine. So if you've got business, speak up loud enough for the chickens to hear. Kenneth cleared his throat and glanced at Karen, who gave a sharp nod. We believe there has been intentional interference with a community amenity, he said. The lake, to be specific. Multiple residents have filed complaints, and after investigation, it appears water flow into the lake has been severely restricted. We have reason to believe this restriction originates from your property. I stared at him a moment, then gave a slow shrug. The flow originates here. Always has. You got paperwork that says I'm required to give it to you. He hesitated. That pause told me everything I needed to know. He didn't have a legal leg to stand on, and he knew it. Karen stepped forward, face flushed with heat and frustration. This is sabotage, Mr. Harlan. And it's childish. You can't hold the community hostage because of a minor structural correction. Minor structural correction. That was how she described bulldozing Lila's bridge. I clenched my jaw, felt my fingernails dig into my palm. I took a breath, looked her dead in the eye, and said, You trespassed on private land, destroyed a memorial my wife built with her own hands, and now you're shocked the well ran dry? That's not sabotage, Karen. That's karma with plumbing. Kenneth stepped in again, trying to cool things down. We're hoping for a cooperative resolution, he said. A restoration of water flow. If not, the board is prepared to pursue legal action. I laughed. Loud and long. Tucker even barked like he was in on the joke. You'll sue me to make me give you something I own? Be my guest. But make sure your board knows something before they throw more money into lawyers. Your lake exists because of a temporary flow agreement from 2009. That agreement expired in 2019. You continued using the resource without renewal, without payment, and without consent. You're not victims. You're squatters. And I just changed the locks. Karen's face turned redder than the summer tomatoes on my porch. She sputtered something about civil responsibility and mutual benefit, but Kenneth was already tugging her back toward the SUV. He offered a weak smile, said they'd be in touch, and then drove off, tires kicking up dust like a retreating army. I watched them vanish down the road and returned to my trenching, heart lighter than it had been in years. That night, HOA members gathered near the lakeside gazebo, holding flashlights and clipboards like some kind of panicked PTA meeting. I watched through binoculars from my porch, sipping iced tea and scratching behind Tucker's ears. I could hear bits and pieces, complaints about the smell, fears about property value, accusations flung in every direction. Someone brought up the possibility of bringing in a water truck, but another resident shouted that the cost would be astronomical. Karen tried to regain control by claiming they were exploring multiple avenues. Someone else asked if she had approval to destroy my bridge in the first place. That question went unanswered. The following morning, a new sign appeared near the lake entrance. Temporarily closed due to environmental maintenance. A weak excuse, clearly meant to save face. The truth was more embarrassing than they could ever admit. Their pride, their centerpiece, their shiny brochure selling point, was dying. Not because I poisoned it or broke it or even touched it. I simply stopped feeding it. That lake depended on the kindness of the land it disrespected. And that kindness had finally expired. By midweek, Gary Dempsey returned, standing near the lake with a puzzled look on his face. He wasn't working this time, just observing, trying to make sense of what went wrong. He spotted me and raised a hand in awkward greeting. I nodded back. He made his choices, but I couldn't blame him entirely. He was just a tool Karen used. A man with a machine and no knowledge of the consequences. Maybe now he was learning. A local news van showed up on Thursday. Some reporter with a too-white smile began filming a segment near the water's edge talking about unexplained changes in a private HOA-managed lake and concerns from residents. Karen stood beside him, forced grin glued to her face, spouting nonsense about unusual weather patterns and maintenance setbacks. The moment the reporter asked if she had a permit to demolish a bridge on private land, her voice faltered. It was beautiful. Back on my porch that evening, Sheriff Boone arrived again. No sirens, no warnings, just a nod and a cooler of sweet tea. They called me 3 times today, he said, chuckling. Told me they might need emergency law enforcement support over a water dispute. I raised an eyebrow. Did you tell them we don't do civil wars in this county? He laughed. Something like that. We sat there in silence, watching the sun set behind the brown water and the furious silhouettes pacing along the dead shore. This wasn't just about water anymore. This was about who held the power. And for the first time in years, it wasn't Karen or her bylaws or her smug little meetings. It was me. It was the land. And it was just getting started. The next week brought a level of absurdity I didn't think even Karen was capable of. It started with a knock on my gate. 2 HOA volunteers wearing matching fluorescent vests and clipboard lanyards that made them look like they'd wandered away from a middle school field trip. They were there, they said, to assess environmental runoff and coordinate community conservation. I stood there in my flannel shirt, holding a shovel, covered in dirt and sweat, and stared at them like they were speaking Martian. When I asked if they had jurisdiction to be on my property, they pointed to a laminated sheet that said, Community Initiative Zone. I pointed to my No Trespassing sign, which was older, bigger, and legally backed. They left in a hurry, calling someone on their walkie-talkie like they were part of a military operation. Karen's fingerprints were all over it. The lake looked worse by the hour. A thick, oily film spread across the surface like a disease. A few of the HOA homes that backed right up to it started putting up tarps to block the view, not just to hide the smell but to protect their home values from potential buyers driving past. The water was now too low for anyone to paddle, let alone fish, and the local birds had found better company at a distant retention pond near the highway. The grand gazebo where Karen used to hold HOA parties now sat silent, with cobwebs forming in the corners and wasps nesting in the rafters. It was a ruin disguised as a community feature. Karen, of course, didn't take this well. She summoned the board for a special session, and I only heard about it because Gary Dempsey stopped by under the pretense of asking about a lost wrench. He leaned on my fence post, sheepish, clearly caught between loyalty to his job and curiosity about how I'd pulled off what he now clearly understood was deliberate. They're saying you sabotaged the infrastructure, he mumbled. Karen's talking about emergency HOA levies to fund a filtration system or rerouting water from the next town over. I whistled low. That's going to cost them a fortune. He nodded slowly, kicking the dirt. Some folks already listing their homes. HOA dues went up again. People are pissed. I offered him a cold lemonade, which he accepted without a word. We both knew the game had changed. The HOA was crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance, and Karen was doing her best to act like the walls weren't closing in. The next morning, I caught wind of a rumor that Karen was planning a formal clean-up event at the lake to make it appear like the situation was under control. I didn't need binoculars to see the spectacle unfold. Kids were handed plastic rakes and told to sweep the algae from the edges while teenagers stood around in knee-high boots, poking dead fish with sticks. Karen wore an oversized sun hat and barked instructions like she was organizing a film shoot. At one point she gave an impromptu speech about resilience and unity, which was nearly drowned out by the sound of a septic truck reversing nearby. I couldn't make this up if I tried. Then came the tanker trucks. Massive metal beasts lumbering in on Friday morning, pulling into the cul-de-sac with blinking lights and the sound of industrial hydraulics hissing. Karen must have pulled strings or emptied a savings account to rent water delivery vehicles from a landscaping company 2 counties over. Her plan was painfully obvious: refill the lake manually, hoping to restore it to some semblance of life. But she hadn't done her homework. The lake was cracked and dried beneath the surface, like a sponge left in the sun. The water poured in quickly, and within hours, half of it had drained right back out through the fractured bottom and the still dormant irrigation outlet. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole the size of a bowling ball. And the look on her face when she saw that failure unfold was priceless. She tried to hide it, turning to scold a teenager who'd let the hose spray the gazebo steps, but the cameras caught it. News vans returned, and this time they weren't there to ask questions, they were there to record the downfall. The best part came when a neighbor named Janet, who up until then had been a quiet board member, stood up in the middle of the Lake Recovery Day and demanded Karen step down. She accused her of mishandling funds, misleading homeowners, and, most importantly, escalating conflict with a landowner she called the only person with a working brain in this whole mess. I nearly dropped my iced tea. A shouting match broke out, followed by at least 3 people walking off the board on the spot. Karen stood frozen, looking like someone had turned off her batteries. Later that evening, Karen came to my gate again. This time she wasn't flanked by lawyers or volunteers. She came alone, holding what I assume was supposed to be an olive branch in the form of a rolled-up map and a folder of papers. She didn't step onto my land. Just stood there awkwardly and said, "I believe we may have overstepped." I let the silence drag on so long it felt like a second summer had started. When I finally replied, I said, "No, Karen. You didn't just overstep. You trespassed, you destroyed, and you disrespected something you never even tried to understand." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The folder in her hands trembled slightly. "We'd like to propose a settlement," she said. "To restore relations and possibly—" I cut her off. "I don't want money. I don't want your lake. I want my bridge back. And I want a public apology at your next HOA meeting." Her eyes widened. "That's—" she began, but I didn't let her finish. "Non-negotiable." She left without responding. I didn't expect her to cave right away. She was the type to believe she could twist her way out of anything. But I knew she'd felt the pressure. The lake was her crown jewel, and now it was a toilet bowl ringed in shame. The residents were angry. The board was fractured. And the sheriff? He hadn't responded to her last 3 calls. Probably too busy laughing with the rest of us. That night, I sat by the old creek bed, Tucker at my feet, stars glittering above like Lila's sketches come to life. I could hear frogs chirping in the distance, the sound of nature slowly reclaiming what had been warped by ego and greed. The water still flowed beneath me, cold and silent, moving through the underground channel like a secret that belonged only to us. I hadn't pulled the final lever yet. The full cutoff valve was still intact. If Karen tried to play one more game, I'd drain that lake so fast the fish wouldn't have time to say goodbye. But for now, I was patient. I wanted her to sweat. Because revenge wasn't just about payback. It was about memory. And they were all about to remember whose land this really was. The 5th chapter of this entire mess didn't begin with a bang, it began with silence. The kind that settles like a fog before a storm. No leaflets on my porch, no HOA drones patrolling the trail behind my fence, no Karen sightings for 3 straight days. The lake had dropped to record lows, the fish were all gone, and the once boastful sign near the front gate that read, "Crystal Shores Lakefront Community," had been quietly taken down and replaced with a banner advertising a last-minute HOA barbecue. It was a thinly veiled distraction effort to keep homeowners from asking too many questions while their home values sank along with their backyard waterfronts. I didn't trust the silence. Karen wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat with grace. She was the type to dig in, lie low, and wait for the perfect moment to pull something underhanded. I knew she had a move left. The only question was how desperate it would be. That answer came on a Wednesday evening just after sunset. Sheriff Boone pulled into my driveway with that look on his face that told me the kettle was about to whistle. He stepped out with a manila envelope in his hand and a slow shake of his head. "They filed an injunction," he said, handing it to me. "Claim you're deliberately disrupting an ecological system and interfering with community safety infrastructure. And get this, they're trying to label your irrigation system as a protected water resource." I opened the envelope, flipping through the legal nonsense as Boone continued. "She got a new lawyer. One of those types who uses phrases like eminent domain and historical utility rights." I scoffed and tossed the papers onto the porch table. "They think they can take my land over a puddle?" Boone shrugged. "They think they can scare you into backing off. Probably figured the threat of county involvement might rattle you." I looked him square in the eye. "They're going to need a hell of a lot more than paper threats to rattle me, Boone." I spent the next day preparing for whatever stunt they had planned. I walked every inch of my boundary line, checking for new markers, hidden sensors, even fresh tire tracks. I installed trail cams near the irrigation access point, reinforced the trench cover, and double-checked the flow gate mechanism. The HOA wanted a war of attrition, but they didn't realize I'd already fortified every weak point weeks ago. My land wasn't just a property, it was a fortress, a memorial, and a weapon all in one. Lila had seen this coming. I could feel it every time I flipped through her old notes. She had drawn contingency plans for the water system. She even left behind a schematic for a full directional reversal. If I wanted to, I could send the water backward and flood the HOA's own greenbelt. I didn't plan to go that far. But knowing I could, that was enough to make me sleep like a baby. On Friday afternoon, a black SUV showed up again. Karen was in the back seat, window cracked just enough for her to shout without fully committing to stepping on my property. "We have a hearing scheduled next week," she called out. "The judge will want to know why you're refusing to cooperate." I leaned against the porch post, straw in my mouth, watching her the way one might observe a peacock trying to fly. "The judge is going to see a grieving man defending his land from a bunch of uniform-wearing busybodies who think they're more important than the law." She flinched slightly but recovered. "You're hurting the whole community over a footbridge." I smiled. "That bridge was more solid than your entire board, Karen." She didn't answer. The window rolled up, and the SUV rolled away. That evening, I opened the irrigation hatch again. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to remind myself what real control felt like. The tunnel echoed with the soft rush of water still trickling into the remnants of the lake. I turned the valve another 20%, slowing the flow to a whisper. It wasn't the full shutoff, not yet. But it would be enough to kill the last remaining illusion the HOA had managed to cling to. They wanted to bring this to court? Fine. Let them explain why their lake died while the stream on my side still sang like a spring brook in April. By Saturday, the barbecue was in full swing. HOA volunteers bustled about with trays of grilled corn and overpriced lemonade while Karen stood beneath the gazebo trying to pretend everything was fine. But the lake behind her told the truth. Brown water ringed with algae and weeds, a smell that wouldn't wash off, and kids who refused to go anywhere near the shoreline. Several families whispered to each other behind paper plates, casting glances toward my property like it was some forbidden land full of answers. Some even nodded at me as I rode past slowly on my old tractor, Tucker in the back like a sentinel. I didn't wave, didn't smile. Just kept driving. The message was clear. That night, something strange happened. A letter arrived, not a legal one, not a threat. Just a simple handwritten envelope slipped into my mailbox. It was from a homeowner named Brian, someone I barely knew but who lived across the lake. His note was short. "I didn't vote for her. Most of us didn't. We're sorry. Let us know how we can make it right." I stared at that letter for a long time. It wasn't an admission of guilt. But it was a crack. And cracks, if you know anything about irrigation, are where the pressure always breaks first. Sunday morning brought the final straw. I received a second notice, this one from a county inspector who'd been roped in by Karen's new legal team. They were trying to label my irrigation system a public dependency resource. If they succeeded, they could legally argue that it was a utility, even though the HOA had no standing contract, no payment record, and no legal claim. They were reaching so hard it was almost funny. Almost. I drove straight to the sheriff's office, map in hand, photos of the dried-up lake, drone footage of the valve, copies of the original easement agreement, and a notarized letter Lila had written in 2012. In it, she clearly stated that no future HOA agreement could use the irrigation channel without renegotiation. It was her land then. It was my land now. Boone took one look at the folder and let out a low whistle. "This is enough to shut them down cold," he said. "You want me to file it with the county?" I nodded. "Do it. And make sure they know, if they keep pushing, I'll file a countersuit for trespassing and vandalism. I'm not bluffing, Riley. Not anymore." Boone grinned as he grabbed the keys to his cruiser. "You never were, Mitch." As I watched him drive off, I knew the final curtain was getting close. The HOA was out of cards. Karen was backed into a corner. All that remained was the last decision, the one where she'd either beg for peace or go down swinging. Either way, I was ready. The land was on my side. The water was mine. And Lila's bridge, even in memory, was stronger than any law they could throw at me. The final blow didn't come with shouting or lawyers or news crews. It came with a whisper, a folded piece of paper slipped under my front door just after dawn. The sun hadn't risen high enough to cut through the morning mist, and the whole property was still cloaked in the hush of early light. Tucker sniffed it first, growling low at the door. I opened it expecting another summons or complaint, but what I found was different. It was a handwritten note, the same tight, spidery script I now recognized from previous HOA letters. Only this one wasn't covered in legal jargon. It was an apology. From Karen. Not signed with flourish or excuse, just a shaky line at the bottom. "I was wrong. You win. Please don't kill the lake completely." I read it twice, then sat down slowly on the porch steps, letting the quiet wrap around me. It didn't feel like victory. Not exactly. It felt like a storm had passed and all that was left were broken trees and mud. But maybe that's what justice feels like when you've been carrying it alone for too long. It doesn't explode. It settles. I looked out toward the lake, what remained of it anyway. It had dropped so low you could see the concrete basin on the far side, the skeleton of the man-made beauty they'd built without understanding what sustained it. Children's paddleboats lay tipped on their sides. Mosquitoes buzzed over still puddles. And Karen? She hadn't shown her face since the failed injunction. That same afternoon, Sheriff Boone called. He sounded more amused than usual. "Board meeting tonight," he said. "You might want to come. Word is they're putting Karen's position to a vote." I didn't need to ask who started the motion. Probably Janet, or Brian, or any number of homeowners who had slowly begun realizing that the whole disaster could have been avoided if someone had just treated me like a person instead of a problem. I told Boone I'd think about it. He chuckled and hung up with a simple, "Wear your boots." As evening rolled around, I stood in front of the mirror, unsure whether I even wanted to go. Part of me wanted to stay home, pour a drink, and watch the final crumble from afar. But Lila's photo sat on the bookshelf, just behind a piece of driftwood we'd once pulled from that very lake when it was still new and promising. She would have gone. She always believed in showing up when it mattered. I pulled on my boots and headed out, Tucker watching from the window like he understood it wasn't his kind of fight anymore. The community center was packed. Folding chairs arranged in neat rows, a table of awkward refreshments near the wall, and a projector that no one could figure out how to turn on. I stood in the back, arms crossed, watching as Karen walked slowly to the front. Her shoulders drooped, the fire in her eyes now just a flicker. The board members sat beside her, looking equally tired. Karen cleared her throat and began reading a prepared statement. probably written during one of her long nights staring at an empty inbox and a dead lake. She admitted to acting without full authority when she ordered the bridge removed. She admitted to ignoring the easement expiration. She tried to explain that her intentions were to preserve community standards, but even she couldn't sell that line anymore. The room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't boo either. It just stayed still, listening. Then the vote came. A simple hand raise. The majority lifted their arms without hesitation. Karen didn't argue. She stood, nodded stiffly, and walked out without a word. No drama. No final speech. Just silence, and the sound of her heels on the tile floor. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. After she left, Janet stood up and asked if I'd like to speak. I could see every eye in that room turn to me. I hadn't planned anything, hadn't written a speech. I just walked up, nodded once, and looked out over them like I was seeing my land reflected in their eyes. My wife built a bridge, I said. Not because she wanted to cross something, but because she wanted to connect it. That bridge was about beauty and memory. You destroyed it to preserve a rule in a book you didn't write. And the water? It wasn't yours. You borrowed it. Then you acted like you owned it. That's not how neighbors treat each other. No one interrupted. Not a cough, not a shuffle. Just eyes locked on me. I didn't shut off the water to punish anyone. I shut it off to remind you that this community isn't just bylaws and dues. It's people. And you forgot that. Then I turned and walked out, not waiting for claps or questions. I didn't need them. That night, under the full moon, I opened the hatch one last time. The water was still there, steady and clean, like it had been waiting for permission. I turned the valve gently, not all the way, just enough to let a trickle return. It wasn't a gift. It was a warning. Respect the land, and it gives back. Abuse it, and it dries up. Nature doesn't care about politics. It remembers who listens. The next morning, I found another note in the mailbox. This time from Brian again. The board voted to fund reconstruction of your bridge. No tricks. We've already hired a carpenter. Hope it's a start. Attached was a copy of the budget approval and a handwritten list of volunteers who'd signed up to help. I stood there for a long moment, reading their names, feeling something I hadn't in weeks: relief. Not joy, not triumph. Just relief that the story might end where it started, with people building instead of tearing down. A few weeks later, the new bridge stood where Lila's once did. It wasn't exactly the same, the wood was different, the railings a bit straighter, but the soul of it returned. I planted the same wildflowers along the path. Tucker lay beneath the finished planks like he used to, watching butterflies drift in the breeze. The lake had started to recover too, slower than before, but steady. The smell faded, the water cleared, and a few birds came back. The brochures didn't brag about it anymore, but maybe that was for the best. Karen moved out not long after. Sold her house quietly and left without ceremony. No one threw a party. No one shed a tear. Some said she went to join a bigger HOA in a fancier town. I figured she'd probably try to run it within a month. But that was no longer my concern. Out here, on my land, things were simpler again. The water flowed, the bridge stood, and the memory of Lila drifted on the breeze like the song of the stream she once protected. The HOA learned a lesson that summer. Not from court rulings or fines, but from the land itself. You don't control what you never earned. You don't dictate what you never built. And you never, ever steal a man's bridge.